This is part 3 of the Kyosho Lazer ZX6 build series. So I have the front and rear shock towers mounted, and those towers mount onto a call it a bulkhead or a mount. What does the manual call it? The manual calls it a part number. It's basically a bulkhead of some sort where you mount both the shock tower and your inner camber link ball studs, and there's a piece for the front and there's a similar looking piece for the rear. And because it's one single unit, it's a new piece for the ZX6 compared to what the ZX5 had, which, if you're familiar with Kyosho parts, was this piece here for your ball stud mounts and this piece here to mount your shock tower. And this slotted into this guy and to these sort of 4 holes here, and then you screwed this, you slot this around your gearbox cover, and then you screw it into the gearbox, and then that's how everything mounts. The problem with this assembly here is that both of these pieces did tend to break from time to time if you really abused them. I didn't manage to break this on my ZX5, although I know of people who have, but I did manage to snap one of these guys. I think I landed upside down. I just took a jump very poorly, and it put a lot of pressure on the shock tower, which put pressure on the shock tower mount, and it snapped, I think like here or something, or maybe it snapped around these parts. I don't quite remember. Any case, these can break. So basically what Kyosho did is they made the material around the ball stud mount thicker, and also the same material as this piece, because I think this plastic here is maybe a little softer than this plastic. So the ball stud itself mounts into a chunkier piece of material. It's the same depth here where it actually mounts, but the depth of the plastic around the mount is the same thickness now, whereas here it's not. You can see there's a little sort of lip going up here where the ball stud mounts into, and all the material around is a little bit thinner. So it's a little beefier here. And also for the shock tower mount, there's more bracing of the shock tower against the mounting holes. So this should hold better in the event that you drive like a moron and land upside down. Again, the rear is kind of a similar setup, not exactly the same shape, but the idea using thicker, beefier material to brace the rear shock tower, and also having a single integrated unit for the shock tower mount and the inner ball stud mount. So that's kind of neat. And I wanted to pause at this part of the build just to go over this and illustrate this a little bit better. Despite the fact that this sequence of steps is not that much more work than what I showed in the last video. So the shock towers themselves, just to give you a sense of what's going on here, they mount with 4 screws onto the shock tower mount, and then that whole mount assembly, it just slots right over the gearbox cover, and then you mount 4 screws in there to secure it to the gearbox. The actual gearbox cover attaches to the gearbox with 6 screws, very similar to the B44 gearbox. You use 6 screws to put it together. So when you put in the top gearbox cover, you really only you put in screws to the sort of centermost holes, okay, just those 2 screws, and then the other 4 screws are taken care of when you use 4 screws to mount this whole assembly onto the top gearbox. So instead of pointing at it, I'll show it to you in the manual to be a little more explicit here. So here, for example, right, we mount the gearbox cover. There's 6 screw holes. You just use the front 2, or the rear 2 rather, to secure the gearbox cover to the gearbox. And then these other 4 holes, right, when you mount this piece on, these 4 screws slot through those 4 holes and mount this assembly onto the gearbox. Okay, these are 18mm screws, so they do take a little while to thread all the way in, but you'll get there eventually. So that's kind of neat. Basically, if you want to service the differential, because there's no upper deck, getting to that would require eventually disconnecting the sway bar and the shocks from the shock tower, and then you just take out these 4 screws here and then those 2 other screws, and that should pretty much do it in terms of getting to the diff, unless I'm missing something. So it should be fairly straightforward to get to the diffs. Not too bad. Next up is getting ready to mount the steering assembly. And there are actually 2 options for setting up the steering. They have a bell crank with a straight portion here and a bell crank with an angled, a 90-degree angle portion here. And this all depends on whether you want to mount your servo sideways like this or straight like this. And which one you decide on actually kind of depends on your motor layout. If you're running the motor up front like this, which is a more conventional layout for a saddle pack, that means the receiver would have to probably go here, and your speed control would have to go here. There may not be enough space to mount the servo in line. You may have to mount it sideways in a more conventional fashion. If you mount the motor in the back, then there's a little bit more space over here to put your electronics. So you can actually, if you wanted to, mount the servo sideways like this. But maybe if your electronics are small enough with either motor configuration, you could fit the servo this way or this way. Okay, but I am using a conventional saddle pack setup. I figure with this setup, it gives you a better weight distribution throughout the front and rear of the chassis. If you mount the motor in the back, you're putting a lot more weight in the rear, or a larger percentage of your weight is towards the rear. The only things that are up front are your servo and your receiver, which are relatively light. The bulk of the weight is towards the back. So this should give you more neutral handling than this type of setup. At least that's my guess. But you know, I can talk forever about setup. So I'm going to go with this assembly here, which is the sideways mounting. That's steps 14 to 18. And then after that, I looked ahead a little bit. You start putting together the slipper clutch and basically the center portion of the drivetrain. So we'll see how this part goes. Maybe I'll have some interesting things to say about it, and then I'll make another video. So thanks for watching.